is because I'm about to do something this morning that maybe you've never seen done in church before. Okay, as long as you promise to keep it between you and I and you don't tell anybody, I'm about to do something that some of you have never seen done in church before. I'm about to admit out loud that this story about Jesus going in the grave and literally coming out 3 days later alive is a lot harder to believe than a lot of us church folks would like people to think. Okay, and I hope nobody gets mad at me for saying this, but I'll even go a step further and say that there's a lot of church people, I would bet, in the room this morning who don't actually believe a word of the song that we just sang. But you sang it, and maybe you even raised your hand and did the touchdown thing, right? And the reason you did that is not because you're a bad person or even because you're a fake person. No, I think the reason we do that sometimes is because I think some of us, especially if you've been around church a while, we feel both an external and an internal pressure to pretend like we buy into the hype a whole lot more than we actually do. It's like when I went on one of my first dates, I went out with my wife, and I took her to go see a chick flick because I was trying to impress her. You know how we do that, fellas? You know, you're like, yeah, that movie looks amazing. We go see the movie, and we get done with the movie, and she's like, so what'd you think? You know? And I'm like, well, I'm not going to tell her that, you know, the only reason I didn't, like, stab myself in the eye with a straw in my blue Slurpee during that movie is because that probably wouldn't help my chances of making out with her later. And that was what I was hoping was going to happen. When she told me, she looked so excited. She's like, wow, that was amazing. What'd you think? And I was like, yeah, I'm pretty sure that masterpiece that we just watched is it's one of the most beautiful movies I've ever seen in my life. It's so good. She's like, are you serious right now? I'm like, I'm serious. I'm telling you right now that history will prove me right, okay? Like someday people are going to look back and they will agree with the statement that I am about to make today, and that is the Sisterhood of the Traveling Pants Part 2 is one of the greatest movies to ever grace the big screens. And I'm just happy that I was alive to see with my one true love, you know? Just kidding. I didn't say that on the first date. That would be real creepy, you know? But you ever been in a situation like that where it's not really, you just kind of sort of feel the pressure to buy into the hype, right? And I think if we're honest, I think that's what Easter does to some of us. I think there's some of us that we're in a room like this, and again, it doesn't matter if this is like someone tricked you into coming to church and you're like, I don't even like church, or maybe you come to church every Sunday. I think when it comes to this conversation, we're all in the same lane. I think there are a lot of us in here who have been pretending for a long time that we really buy into this story of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. I think there are a lot of us in here, if we're honest, who have some doubt about it. I think there are people in the room who are afraid to acknowledge to God and maybe to yourself that, man, I don't know. I get it that we're all like, yeah, you know, he is real, but I don't know if I really believe that he actually, literally, if it's a symbol or some kind of metaphor to get us all excited, that's one thing, but I don't know that I actually fully, completely, truly believe that Jesus, literally, a man, went in the grave, and 3 days later, he came out, and he was alive. And I'm not going to ask for any, you know, but if that's you this morning, okay, if you have some doubt, maybe a little bit of doubt, maybe a lot of doubt, if you don't believe any of this stuff, I want to challenge you to do something that may be hard for you this morning. I want to challenge you to acknowledge your doubt out loud. Okay, I want to challenge you this morning to just be honest with God and with yourself that the story we're talking about today is really hard to believe. And here's why I want to ask you to do that this morning. I want to ask you to do that this morning because I think that you will be surprised at how Jesus responds to your doubt. And I think some of you may be shocked to find that when it comes to doubt and having a hard time believing the Easter story, you are actually in really, really good company. Because guess what? The writers tell us, eyewitness account tell us that 2,000 years ago, even Jesus' closest friends had a really hard time believing the story of resurrection. Did you guys know that? Do you know that? Do you know that, Joe? Did you know that his friends? You do. Thanks for telling the rest of us, because we didn't know that. But it's still crazy when you read the story. And we're going to see in a little bit that these are the people that he spent years hanging out with. This was his inner circle. And they had such a hard time believing his resurrection that the writers tell us that they didn't even see it coming, even though he predicted it. Right? It's like that scene from Dumb and Dumber and Dumb and Dumber fans in here. Remember that scene? He's like, I just got robbed by a little old lady on the motorized cart. Anybody know? And I didn't even see it coming. Right? That's what the disciples were like when Jesus came back. I mean, not exactly, but you get the point. They didn't see it coming. John chapter 20 is where we're going to spend a lot of our time today. I just want to give you a little bit of a context if you're not familiar with it. If you don't have a Bible with you and other people around you have a Bible, don't worry. Don't feel pressure. We're going to put the words up on the screen. But let me give you a little bit of a context, okay? Eyewitness account tell us that 2,000 years ago, there was a 30-something-year-old Middle Eastern woodworker turned carpenter named Jesus who claimed to be the Son of God. And that claim got him killed. And after he took his last breath on a wooden cross, people tell us that they took his lifeless body and they put it in the tomb. And here's a part of the story that maybe a lot of us aren't familiar with. The writers tell us that the religious leaders of the day, they remembered that when Jesus was alive, he told them that he was going to come back from the dead, right? And they didn't want anybody to go steal his body and pretend like he'd come back to life. You know, anybody remember the movie Weekend at Bernie's? You remember that movie? You know? Right? This is you were younger, like, what are you talking about? Go Google it when you get home. But it's this movie where these guys are basically taking a dead body around, trying to pretend like he's alive. And the religious leaders, they didn't want any of Jesus' friends to steal his body and be like, he's alive. And so here's what they did. They went to Pilate. This is so fascinating. They went to Pilate, and they're like, hey, we know that they may steal his body, and we don't want any kind of conspiracy or hoax. So here's what we need you to do, bro. We need you to put a seal on the tomb, and we need you to put a guard in front of the tomb to make sure no one steals the body. And Pilate said yes. He put a seal on the tomb and he put a guard on the tomb. Okay, not guard like Paul Blart, mall cop, JCPenney with a baton. No, guard like Leonidas from 300. Anybody know what I'm talking about? If you don't know who that is, he's a Spartan warrior that had abs in places I didn't know it was possible to have abs. I'm like, this is just amazing, right? He put a guard in front of the tomb so nobody would steal the body. So even in the story itself, this is amazing. Even in the story itself, we know that there were people who were afraid of a conspiracy. They were like, they may steal his body and spread this rumor. And that's where we jump in, John chapter 20. This is amazing. Check it out. It says, early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark out, it says, Mary, not Peter, not John, right? Not Bartholomew, not Andrew, not any of the dudes that this guy spent 3 years telling them. Jesus basically ruined the end of the movie. All right, like, I'm going to tell you what's going to happen. I'm going to die, and they're going to think it's over, and I'm going to come back. He told them over and over again, but none of them were there. No, it was a woman named Mary who went to the tomb. And it says when she got to the tomb, it says she saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. So remember, they put a stone in front of the tomb, and there was a guard, and there was a seal. The seal had been broken, the guard wasn't there, and the stone was moved. And when Mary saw that, she did what you would do if you get home from work tomorrow night, and you notice that your front door is on the sidewalk. And you're like, I'm pretty sure I locked my door before I left, and I put the deadbolt in, and you're like, it's in my driveway right now. My entire door is just gone, right? You're like, shoot, what am I going to do? I got to get some help. And they didn't have cell phone back then, and so she had to just hop on a donkey, call an Uber, or whatever it is. And it says in verse 2 that she came running to Simon Peter. Don't miss this. This is so exciting. She went to Simon Peter. Simon Peter is one of Jesus' closest friends. It was one of his BFFs, wasn't he? And then she says she also went to the other disciple, the one that Jesus loves. Quick side note on the side here. The gospel account that we're reading, this eyewitness account, was written by one of Jesus' disciples named John. And John had this weird habit of referring to himself as the disciple who Jesus loved. It's a little bit annoying, but also quite adorable. It's like, So he's talking about himself. It's like the people who are like, I'm like, my mom's favorite kid. It's just okay, maybe you are, but you don't need to tell us that. It's a little annoying, right? So John just likes to call himself, I'm the disciple that Jesus loved. Listen to what he says. So he's talking about himself. He says, the woman came and she says, they have taken the Lord out of the tomb. And we don't know where they put him. Right? She's like, they stole Jesus' body. I told y'all we should have put a ring camera right outside the tomb. We knew this was going to happen. They stole his body. And listen to what happens. He says, so Peter and the other disciple, John, started for the tomb. They're like, what? They took his body and they just started running towards the tomb. It says in verse 4, both were running. But the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. I don't know how many of you guys saw this. I posted a video on Instagram yesterday. We had an Easter egg hunt yesterday out there. It was amazing. And the first run we did was 3 and under. And Lucy's like 2 and change. It's really her first Easter egg hunt thing. And she had her bag. Did anybody see this video? And they cut the thing and they're like, go. You're supposed to go get all the eggs. And she just starts running. Like she's just running. And my wife's recording is like, we're like, what is she doing? Like all the other kids are picking it up. And she's just booking it. And she just runs all the way. And it's the cutest thing ever because she thought it was a race. Like she's got her basket and she saw all these kids. She's like, we're about to race, And so they're like, go. And she's just little legs. She's just running and running. And my wife's just laughing, going like, she's not getting any eggs. She's like, it's a race and I will win, I'm like, that's my girl. Let's go. Gotta get her on track or something, I mean, if you heard me preach on Easter on this passage, you've probably heard me say this many times, but I'm going to say it again because I want to make sure it's not lost on us that John just interrupted what is arguably the most important story in the entire Bible to let us know that he's a faster runner than Peter. Isn't that crazy? Like we're talking about how it's a crisis. They're like, we don't know where the body of Jesus is, And Peter and John are like, let's go find it. And John's like, hey, Mary, I know we got to deal with this, but I just need you to know I'm a faster runner than Peter. I got there before he got there. I don't know when I wrote this in my Bible, but I wrote best, most random verse ever. I'm like, this is awesome. And so when he got there, he says he bent over and he looked in at the strips of linen laying there, but he didn't go in. So John gets there before Peter, and he didn't go in. And it says in verse 6, then Simon Peter came along behind him. If you have a pen, underline the word behind him for no reason other than this is John's way of letting us know, in case we missed it the first time, that he's faster than Peter, He's like, he's still behind me for the record. And he went straight in the tomb. He saw the strips of linen laying there, as well as the cloth that had been wrapped around Jesus' head. The cloth was still laying in its place, separate from the linen. And it says in verse 8, finally, the other disciple, referring to himself, who had reached the tomb first. Okay, we get it, John. You're faster, all right? You're the Usain Bolt of the disciples, It's settled. Can we move on to the story now? So he went ahead, and then he says this. He saw and, what's that word? Believed. Now, this is so fascinating, okay? And we're laughing about the race thing or whatever. Part of what John's doing here is he's documenting his own unbelief. His own doubt. And when he says he saw and believed, that's not he saw and believed that Jesus rose from the dead. That's he saw and believed that, the body was stolen. Isn't that crazy? Like he's letting us know the progression. He's like, I got to the tomb first, but when I got there, I didn't want to go inside. And that's what a lot of us do sometimes with our doubt, right, with God. Like it's just a lot easier. How many of you know it's a lot easier sometimes to just kind of stand at the entrance? Right, it's a lot easier than to confront the weight that we feel inside. And so John's like, I just got there and I just stood at the door because I'm like, I don't know. I don't know if I'm ready to face whatever might be in this tomb. And then all of a sudden Peter goes in and he's like, then I looked and then I believed. Not I believed that Jesus rose from the dead. No, he's like, I believe that the body was stolen. Listen to what, this next verse is so anticlimactic, it almost ruins the entire story. Listen to what he says next. It says in verse 9, it says, they still did not understand from the scriptures that Jesus had to rise from the dead. They're like sitting there, there's no body, the tomb's empty, and they're like, I don't know what's going on here. And then I love verse 10. This is just so, it says, then the disciples, you ready for this? It says, they went back to where they were staying. Can you believe this? They went home. Can you believe that when Jesus' closest friends got to the tomb, and his body wasn't there, their response was, oh, that's a bummer. Guess someone stole his body. And John's like, hey, Peter, man, I'm gassed from that race. Peter said, it wasn't a race. Like, it was a race. I'm gassed. So can we call an Uber or something and just go back to the motel and just go back and just go hang out? Like, can we go do that? I think the game's on at 1 o'clock. Okay, if we leave right now, we'll be back for the game. Okay, if we miss it, we're not going to get to watch it later because, it's the first century and they don't have DVR yet. We gotta get back. They just went back home to their regularly scheduled programming. You know why? Because it never even occurred to them to think that maybe the reason there's no body in the tomb is because Jesus did what he said he was going to do. That's how hard it was to believe in the resurrection. They're like, well, we're just going to go back home. I heard a quote from Andy Stanley a long time ago that really resonated with me when I was reading this verse. He said this. He says, nobody expected nobody. It's kind of clever, but also true. Nobody did. Even though he told them, even though he predicted it, even though he laid it all out, nobody, not Peter or John or Andrew or Bartholomew or any of the other guys that I can't name because their names aren't as popular as those guys, not one of them expected a body. And maybe I'm just giving them a little bit too much credit, but you would think that after all the time that Jesus spent with his disciples, that there would at least be a couple of them just waiting to see what happens in the tomb, right? Like you would think that there would at least be one or two guys, maybe Peter, because Peter is like, he always takes a step before he thinks about it. He talks before he thinks. You would think that maybe Peter would have been get a lawn chair, and just sitting out there on the third day, like, let's just see what happens, right? Wouldn't that have been a great story? To be like on the third day, and Peter's sitting out there in the tomb. He had a launcher, had a whole thing of popcorn, and he's on Facebook Live. And he's like, you guys ready? 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Boom, there he is. I told you. He told us. In your face, Pilate, look, there he is. Right, you would think that somebody would have been expecting to know, but the writer says that, what did he say? He said they just went home. Hard to believe, isn't it? That not one of his best friends saw it coming. And it gets even crazier than that. The writers tell us that when Jesus started appearing to people and people saw him, and people went to tell the disciples that, hey, yo, man, I know he died, but we saw him. They completely brushed him off. Let me show you real quick. This is amazing. Gospel of Luke. If you have a Bible with you, flip with me to Luke. I think it's chapter 23. Yeah, listen to what happens, okay? So Jesus appeared to the women, which is awesome, by the way, right? He's like, I'm going to make an appearance. First, I'm going to go to the ladies, And so he appears to the women, and the women find out that Jesus is risen. And so they're like, man, let's go tell his friends that he's alive. And so listen to what he says in verse 10. He said, it was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the others with them who told this to the apostles. So they go back to Jesus' friends and they're like, hey man, he's alive. And listen to what he says in verse 11. This is amazing to me. If I wasn't reading it from my own Bible, I'm not sure that I would believe that this is in the Bible. Listen to what he says in Luke chapter 23, verse 11. It says, but they, you ready for this? Still did not believe the women. Another translation says this. It says that they thought that they were making it up. Isn't that crazy? These women came over and they're like, hey, we seen him. We saw an angel. They told us he's alive like he said he would. And he says that they didn't believe the women. And then he says this, because their words seemed to them like nonsense. I mean, I'm not going to lie. It's kind of a little bit refreshing to read that in the Bible. All right, isn't that crazy that these guys are in the story? They are his closest friends. They camped with him. They went to Olive Garden with Jesus. They heard him preach. They saw him perform the craziest miracles. And when the news first broke and people came to them and said, hey, Jesus is alive, they were like, that sounds like complete nonsense. And I just think it's crazy that they didn't even pretend like they believed it. right? They didn't even try to do what people do in the family. Anybody love Family Feud here? I love Family Feud. But you know how there's this unspoken rule in Family Feud that's like, no matter what the person says, what do you say? Good answer, right? They could give the dumbest answer possible, you know? And they're like, good answer, good answer. And you're at home going, no, not good, terrible, awful, worst answer ever. And you can see it on their faces. You can tell that they're just like, you just because there's a lot of money, good answer, good answer. I hate you. You better find your own ride home. Good answer. You would think that his disciples would have been like, yeah, he's risen. Yeah, he's risen indeed. Yeah, sure. They didn't even pretend. They're like, that is nonsense. They're like, girls, you done lost your mind. There's no way he is risen. Now, if you think that's bad, wait till you see how they responded when they actually saw Jesus with their very own eyes. Later in the chapter, in verse 36, listen to what he says. He says, while they were still talking about this, so his disciples basically got together in the room, right? And they're hearing all these rumors that Jesus might be alive. And so they're in the room and they're just whispering, you know, they're like, because they're scared. You know, they lock the deadbolt the door. They're in some basement somewhere, you know, some bunker nobody knows about, no address. Everybody turn your cell phones off, you know, so no one can ping us. Also, the religious leaders can't find us because they killed Jesus and they're afraid they're going to kill him too. And so they're hanging out in a bunker somewhere, whispering to each other like, oh, man, is it true? There's no way, man. That's the craziest thing we've ever heard. He says, while they were doing that, it says, Jesus himself stood among them. And he said, peace be with you. I read this the other day and I thought to myself, man, if there was ever a time in the Bible where one of the disciples like said a swear word, it was right here, right here. Right? Can't you see it? They're just whispering and Jesus shows up right now like, surprise. And they're like, oh my gosh. And Peter walks over to the swear jar and puts $5 in it, you know, and he's like, he just shows up. And he's like, peace be with you. And this is awesome. It says in verse 37, it says they were startled and frightened. They weren't like, what's up, bro? You know, we knew it was going to happen. No, they were like trying to get up the window and get out the stairs, you know. Someone pulled out a baseball bat. Not that you can hit a ghost with a baseball bat, but you got to do something. They were scared to death. And it says this in verse 38. He says, then he said to them, he's like, hey, why are you troubled? Why do doubts arise in your mind? Two quick thoughts about this. Number one, I think it's amazing that these guys were so honest about documenting their own doubt. Like if I were writing my own story and I was one of the eyewitnesses, I would paint myself in a little bit of a better light. I'd be like, you know, like I knew it was going to happen, you know. It just took me some time, you know. They're like, no. The second thought here is, and this is why I always tell people in church, and maybe you don't know this if you're kind of new to this church thing, that, man, I tell people that the most honest place that you can be really is in church in the presence of God. Because he already knows what you're thinking. Right? Like when you tell God what you're thinking, he's not like, wow, I did not see that coming, Sammy. Wow, did you guys see that? All the angels are like, oh, we had no idea. That is a shock to us. He's like, I'm the God of the universe. I hold the universe in the palm of my hands. But I had no idea what you were thinking and feeling this whole time. He walks up to them, and I don't think he was condemning. I wasn't there, but I think he had a smile on his face. I think he just showed up like, peace be with you. You know, it's like, don't freak out. Don't run. Put the bat down, you know. Walks over and put his arm around Peter. It's like, hey, why are you doubting? I told you all this is how the movie was going to go. He says, look at my hands and my feet. It's I myself. It says, touch me and see. It says, a ghost doesn't have flesh and bones as you've seen. And when he has said this, it says in verse 40 that he showed them his hands and his feet. And they still did not believe. I mean, if I'm Jesus at this point, I'm like, okay, we're voting you all off the island right now. Right? I'm sorry, but you're not going to receive a rose today. All of you. I'm going to go recruit new people. A little Bachelor humor. 2 people got that. The rest of you are too holy to watch The Bachelor, right? I would be like, I mean, you guys following the progression? First to go to the tomb. They didn't believe it. And then the women came and said, yo, he's alive. Y'all are crazy. Jesus shows up in person and he is talking to them, and the story is so hard to believe. And they're like, and this time there's a little joy and then a little bit of amazement. And they're looking, they're like, we're still not sure that we believe any of this. And then he says to them, do you have anything to eat? This is so important. Okay, take this with you if you take nothing else from this morning. Notice what Jesus does and how he responds to their unbelief. It's interesting because I think a lot of us think that our doubts and our unbelief makes God distance himself from us. Right? It's like God, when God knows that you're not really sure if you fully believe, if you're like, man, I don't even know the Bible and Jesus and the cross. And I mean, I'm kind of raising my hand saying, but I don't know if I believe any of that. I think a lot of us feel like the more we acknowledge that, the more God's just backing up and like, whoa, whoa, whoa. You know, it's like the more you acknowledge your doubt, the farther back God feels. God's just like, I ain't looking. I'm looking for people who are convinced. And he's just backing up. But you read the story and listen to what Jesus says. It's like the more they doubted, the closer he got. Did you guys see that? Did you guys see how they weren't believing him, and he sent the women, and he appeared to people, and they didn't believe him, and so he's like, okay, I'm gonna just show up. He's like, peace be with you, and they're like, oh, and they still didn't believe him. And what does he do? He gets even closer. He's like, it's okay, Joe, touch my hands, right? Feel my side. He walked around. And everybody got to touch him. Again, if I'm Jesus, I'm like, forget y'all. But Jesus continued to draw close. Is it possible that the thing that a lot of us think makes God withdraw from us is actually the thing that makes him draw closer? The more doubt he saw, the closer Jesus got to his friends. You know, and he's like, go ahead, touch, you know. He's like, no, it's okay. Touch, go ahead. Touch, it's me. And they still don't believe him. And I wish I could have been there for this part because this is my favorite part of the story. And so he's talking to them and they're feeling it. They're still struggling to believe if he's alive because it's hard to believe. And he's like, okay, hey, man. He's like, okay, what I got to do? He's like, anybody got anything to eat? Has anybody got? And Peter's like, oh, shoot. Goes in the fridge. He's like looking through. So we got some Taco Bell in here, and, you know, I don't know how long it's been in there, who's it's for. He's like, oh, there's a name on the box. Let's see, Judas. Oh, yeah, we're not going to touch that, you know. You got anything to eat? Peter's like, let me look. Peter's scrambling through, just looking. He's like, oh, I got something. He's like, I got some leftover fish. I got some leftover red lobster. I went there last night. Peter's like, I got some red lobster. It's a true story. Jesus asked him. If you could throw that up there, Tom. He's like, hey, anybody got anything to eat? And Peter's like, yeah. I don't know how old it is, but, you know, got some red lobster. Just sitting here for a bit. And Jesus like, that'll work. And so Jesus, you know, they bring the food over. Right? That's why you got to read the Bible. Some of you are like, this is in the Bible. This is in the Bible. So he's sitting there, and they don't believe him. You know, and he's like, okay, get me some food. And they get some food out. He's like, oh, this is good. It's a little cold, but he just sits. So he just sits there and he's just like, It's good. I'd give you some, Marge, but I need it for second service. So our budget could only afford 4 shrimp. So I'm going to eat 2 now. I'm going to eat 2 in second service. And they just eat. And I wish I could have been there for this moment. Like if I could get in a DeLorean and go back in time, this is the moment in the story that I want to go back to. And the reason I want to go back to this moment is because I want to be there in the moment where these guys went from, there's no way that happened. That is complete nonsense to, wow, he really is alive. And I believe it so much that I'm going to give my life testifying that he's alive. They believed, finally, that Jesus was alive. Not because they were a part of some vast conspiracy or hoax. You know why they believe? They believe that he was alive because dead men don't eat fish. Like they believe he was alive because dead men don't eat red lobster. And they saw Jesus eat fish. And the writers tell us in that passage that as Jesus was eating the fish, he just kept explaining to them what was happening. It says then their eyes opened, and then Jesus told them that, hey, you are going to be witnesses to these things. And I don't know if you ever thought about it this way, but the reason we celebrate Easter some 2,000 years later today is not just because the Bible says Jesus rose from the dead. No, a big part of the reason we celebrate it today is because those 11 men and all the women who are part of the story gave their lives testifying to what they saw and believed to be true. Right? Like they I don't know if you thought about that. They gave, all but one, I believe, of those men died testifying that they saw a dead man eat fish. And I know that sounds so convenient. Some of you are like, oh, of course, he's friends, they're his best friends, Of course they would say that. Okay, maybe not. But think about this. Why in the world would Jesus' friends risk their lives for a man whose death just disproved everything he ever told them? Remember how much they documented their own unbelief? Right? If they were trying to make up a story, there's no reason to put all that. And then we didn't believe. And then we didn't believe. And then he ate red lobster. And then we believe. They would have just skipped all of that and just said, yeah, man, of course he rose from the dead. Why in the world would they document their unbelief? And why in the world would they risk their lives for a man whose death just disproved everything he ever told them? They saw him and they believed. And I don't know if you have ever heard this before, but I think it's amazing that the writers tell us that it wasn't actually just these 11 and the women. It says that Jesus appeared to over 500 people. Is that crazy to anybody else? That there were over that's more people than there are in this room. That there were 500 people who saw a dead man walking around and they testified about it. I shared that a couple Easters ago, and I had a friend in the room who maybe is like some of you guys, and he's still kind of exploring the faith, and he doesn't really believe the stuff, but I invited him to come anyways, because I'm like, just come. I'll make you laugh. I promise, at the very least, And he texted me afterwards. He's like, that's great. But he's like, you got any evidence besides the Bible? And I'm like, actually, yeah, I do. And maybe that's some of you in the room today, and we got some resources out of the Connect counter. If you're like, I just don't know if I can get my arm around it, at least I asked Jeremy to give us some resources. So if it's not there, you can blame him, But you can go out. It's out there, I'm pretty sure. But we got some resources for you out there. And I'm telling you right now, there's actual historical documented evidence, compelling evidence outside of just the Bible that Jesus was alive and that he rose again. There's a lot of resources out there. You can get it at the table. You can look for it online, and it's not going to answer all of your questions. I just want you to know that. It's not going to answer all of your questions because it's hard to believe. So hard, even the people in the story had a hard time believing it. But what if that doesn't mean it's not true? Right? And I think that's the tension that I hope we embrace before we leave here today. What if the fact that Jesus rising from the dead being hard doesn't mean it's not true? What if it's actually true? What if there really was a Jewish carpenter 2,000 years ago who actually gave his life on a cross for your sins? Right, the Bible says all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. We don't like talking a lot about sin in today's culture, but come on now, be honest. Even if you're not a church person, you know that there's something that's not right about your soul. You know that if there's a God, you fall short of his standards. But what if it's true that 2,000 years ago, God sent his son into the world to be the sacrifice that you and I could not pay on a cross? He gave his life for all of our sins. And what if it's true that 3 days later, he actually did defeat death? It's so hard to believe. But what if it's true that this is the hope that our souls have been longing for? All of our souls. Every single person in here, that's the one thing we have in common, is your soul is restless. And your soul is longing for home. That's why you're never satisfied. That's why you're always restless. That's why we're always chasing thing after thing. It's our soul deep cries out to deep. And what if it's true that Easter is the assurance of our salvation and our resurrection? that his resurrection is the assurance of our salvation and our resurrection. His resurrection is the assurance that we have a hope that we've been looking for our future all of our lives. I went to watch the Super Mario Brothers with my kids a couple days ago. Anybody seen that yet? It's really good. You should go see it. I'm not getting paid to say that, but maybe I should. And we went to see Super Mario Brothers in the theater, and I took my kids, and as we were driving there, I was just trying to hype the movie up, and I'm like, hey, it's going to be, they're like, we're so excited. I'm like, I'm excited. And I'm like, do you think Bowser wins? And they're like, no. I'm like, I think he does. Dads, how sometimes you just like, I don't know, just say stuff just to say stuff, I'm like, I think Bowser wins. They're like, no, he doesn't. I'm like, they're like, he's the bad guy. I'm like, he's just misunderstood, okay? He's just in love. How many of us haven't done crazy things for love? He just loves speech. That's what it is, and they're just going, I'm just like, I'm telling you, man, I think he's going to win. I'm just trying to hype. And then finally Eden, my 11-year-old, she's like, Dad. She's like, there's no way. I'm like, how do you know? You haven't seen the movie. And she's like, well, in all the kids' movies, the good guys always win. And I got sad for a second. So I'm like, oh, shoot, man. She's at that age already. She figured it out. And she's like, there's no way he wins. Because in all the kids' movies, the good guys always win. That's what Easter is supposed to do for us. Easter is our reminder that in Jesus, we win. Easter is our assurance that no matter what life throws at you, you win in Jesus. Easter is God's way of putting a stamp and saying to us, you guys still got time, I promise. Give me a couple of minutes. Not yet, Kat, not yet. Unless you want to stand behind me for an awkward 10 minutes. I want to read you guys a verse in the Bible. And then we're going to pray. And then they're going to come up and do one more song. And then we're going to race to lunch and see who gets there the fastest. Okay, this is amazing. So you remember John, right? The one who talks about himself as the disciple that Jesus loved. Remember him? Anybody remember him? Okay, good. All right. I'll be real sad if no one was paying attention this whole time, So he has this vision towards the end of his life. And if I remember correctly, I think John's actually the only one of the disciples that didn't get killed testifying that Jesus was alive. And God gives him this vision. And I want to read it to you. And I pray that it breathes some hope into you this morning. Listen to what John said he saw in Revelation chapter 23, verse 1. God gave him a vision of how everything is going to end. He says, I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, look, this is the end of the movie. This is how it's all going to end. God's dwelling place is now among the people. And he's going to dwell with them. And they will be his people. And God himself will be with them. And he will be their God. I'm going to read that again because fire emoji. This is it. This is the ending. The people who died testifying to the resurrection. This is the vision that John saw of how all this is going to play out. I don't know who's going to win the next election. I don't know if you're going to get that job or that promotion or what's going to happen 15, 20, 30, 50, 100 years from now. But John's going to say when all of that plays out, here's how it's going to end. Right? Earlier he talks about seeing a new heaven and earth. He says, hey, God's dwelling place is now going to be among the people. God's going to come down and he's going to move into the neighborhood and he's going to live with us. And we're going to be his people and he's going to be our people. And then he says this in verse 4. He says, then he will wipe every tear from their eyes. And there will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain. For the old order of things has passed away. I'm going to leave that for just a few seconds. I need you to just soak that in your soul. This is what Easter secured for us. This is the ending. Okay, again, for the 100th time, it is so hard to believe. I understand that. But there's no middle ground here. It's all in or nothing. Easter is either the biggest bunch of you know what ever, or it is the greatest event in the history of the world because it secured this future for those who are in Christ Jesus. That there's gonna come a time where there's not gonna be any more pain or tears, no hospitals, no prisons, no medication, no depression, no loneliness, no anxiety, no injustice, no racism, no sexism, no tribalism, no cancer, no sickness, no loneliness, no fear, no suicide, no more sleepless nights, no death. I'm gonna bring this a little closer to home. Earlier this year, we lost someone in our community, Craig, and a lot of people don't know this. I love you. But he actually dressed up as an Easter bunny last Easter. And so coming into this Easter, it's kind of weird. Because on the one end, I kept thinking about it. I'm like, man, it's just, like today felt like just a reminder of just, just that loss. Like, man, But on the flip side, today was also just a tangible reminder that Craig lives forever. Okay, and his mom's here, so I'm not trying to put a nice bow on the story. I would not do that. That would be so insensitive of me to use that to tie a nice bow to the Easter story. But that's what Easter secured for us, is that death has been defeated and death has been canceled forever, and that because of Jesus, no matter what comes, this is how our story ends. That if we put our faith in the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ with all of our doubts, that this is the future that awaits us. And I have no doubt in my mind that Craig is living right now in eternity because of Easter, because he defeated death.